Hello, my name is Elizabeth Zelinsky, and I'm here today with Liss, Simon Thorpe, and Sue Ayas of UCLA. Today we'll be discussing our global monetary frameworks, in particular the World Trade Organization. We'll be discussing how our present global financial order has been defined over the past several decades, and how the WTO fits into this narrative, especially in the recent years when the status quo has been shifted by rising powers, and how this debate impacts our current perceptions of the WTO and the work that it does. To begin, Kira will introduce us into the Bretton Woods Conference and how this preceded and created many of the institutions that we know today to regulate our global monetary system, and how the WTO indirectly arose from the system created by the Bretton Woods Conference. Kira?
Okay, so the Bretton Woods Conference was in 1944. It had 44 countries that sent delegates to this conference, but most of the power was held by the United States. And this is especially because the United States had 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. So the Bretton Woods was a system of monetary management, and it established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the countries, the United States, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan. And it focused on promoting economic liberalization and interdependence after World War II. So this was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order that was intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. And the IMF and the World Bank were two institutions created through Bretton Woods, and there was a third institution that was meant to be created called the ITO, which is kind of similar to the WTO, but there were reasons why it never became. And Elizabeth is going to elaborate on that.
Yes, thank you, Kira. So the ITO was intended to be the third leg of the three financial institutions that upheld and maintained the monetary system created by Bretton Woods. Two we know pretty well today, as Kira mentioned, the World Bank and the IMF. The ITO, the International Trade Organization, was never ratified by the American Senate, which is an example of how American power really influenced the way our global monetary system was formed, because the US was able to essentially define which organizations would in fact be constructed and which organizations would end up ultimately failing. The ITO didn't come to pass, but in its place, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, which was signed in Geneva in 1947, became the de facto regulator of international trade for nearly 50 years, until the WTO was created in 1995. It's important to distinguish between other financial regulatory institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO, because although the WTO is structured to benefit US interests, it does not provide the same explicit power to the United States the way the IMF and the World Bank do. Both of those institutions conduct voting proportionally to the amount each nation contributes. And as a result, more wealthy nations who contribute more have a much greater share of the voting power. The WTO is structured to require consensuses between nations. So the US does not have a disproportional percentage of the vote share. However, as an institution, it still benefits the United States, partially because it's the successor of GATT, and GATT was established during a time when the US was the dominant power, both financially and politically, in the world. And so as a result, GATT was structured to benefit American economic objectives, and it defined international trade standards. So when the WTO was created, it aligned with the standards that had been established by GATT, which meant that it also, to some extent, supported US economic interests. Not to mention that GATT provided an opportunity for the US to really develop its economy to become an incredibly powerful and wealthy nation in the wake of World War II. And that really set the platform for the US having this role as the hegemon. So when the WTO was designed, even though there was more of a pluralism in terms of who the world powers were, and there wasn't as much of a situation in which the US was the sole determiner of international frameworks, the WTO still allowed the US to have a significant amount of influence and power. And I think Kira will discuss a little bit more of some of the examples in which the WTO, despite not having necessarily a vast majority of the voting power, can still manipulate situations within the WTO and other trade negotiations to disproportionately serve its own benefits and to marginalize lesser economic powers. Kira?
Thank you, Elizabeth. So one example of the US using their influence over the proceedings of the WTO is the use of trade agreements. These are used to alienate or undermine the potential of rising global economic powers during the WTO negotiations and meetings. So the US government is able to intentionally propose trade agreements that are intended to subvert the power of nations that it perceives to pose a threat, so they can keep themselves safer and in this position of a global hegemon. So in the Wilkinson article, he suggests that the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership were also efforts on the part of the United States to subvert the potential of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, during the World Trade Organization's Doha Development Round negotiations. And NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was also intended to shift power balances when the US felt threatened by the EEC. This was really an effort to keep developing powers out of the general discourse in order to not shift power dynamics and trying to protect the US hegemony.
Perfect. And then Simon, would you be willing to go into a little bit of how these power imbalances and the status quo, which positions the United States as the forefront global economic leader, have been challenged in recent years, and how this framework has been altered by rising powers, which have been sidelined in the past by the United States, but are currently in an effort to alter this status quo?
Of course, thank you. As Elizabeth and Kira have explained already, when the GATT, the predecessor to the WTO, was founded, at the end of World War II, the United States was the dominant economic power in the world. There were other countries that had their own agendas, but America was two large powers that hadn't been largely touched by the war, and they had the ability to get what they wanted in the global trade system. So in these organizations, they were able to promote free trade everywhere except for sectors like agriculture, where America thought it'd be beneficial for them to have protectionism, so they didn't promote free trade in agriculture. So for many decades, it was as if America basically ran the way global trade worked, to the growing discontent of other smaller and not even sometimes not smaller, like just developing countries in general. The U.S. and the EU ran the whole show at the GATT and the WTO for many decades, and it wasn't until after the Tokyo and Uruguay rounds when most of these developing countries finally were able to make a stand against the United States and Europe. In 2001, the Doha rounds, Brazil and India were able to team up, despite having many different opinions themselves for trade. They were able to team up against a common enemy, the United States. And later, joined by China, they were able to push their agenda and for once put the United States and Europe into the defensive and not on the offensive. And that was a big change because that never happened before. Then because of the United States disillusionment with them not being in charge for once, the Doha rounds didn't really get anywhere, and there was a lot of debate and not much conclusions were drawn. The conclusion is that America, when they founded when they began this program, the WTO and the GATT, they did it without the foresight of that the current power structure in the world would change, but it did. And now the new developing countries like Brazil and India have been able to turn the United States' institutions that they spearheaded against them, and it's not making many United States happy. And Sue can elaborate on that.
Sure.
So WTO has mainly been criticized for selectively liberalizing developing countries and forcing them to adapt to neoliberal economic world order. Um, and this was despite strong countries were able to use protectionism for their own benefits. And as Simon said, Brazil, India, and China are getting increasingly more strong. Unfortunately, though, this system is not changing. Even though these three countries are getting stronger and challenging the American hegemony, they're unfortunately adopting neoliberalist methods. And this is problematic in various ways. So the first way this approach is problematic is the asymmetrical trade. When countries with different economic capacities are subjected to the same rules in a competition, it only benefits the strong countries since they expand their markets. As their economy gets stronger, the economy of smaller countries gets more vulnerable and they become defenseless against the holders of capital and against the transnational corporations. Another reason why this is a problem is because it negatively affects the environment. The most obvious and relevant effect is the current pandemic, since it is a direct result of the destruction of wildlife. Another obvious effect is the global warming, which was publicly, there were public demonstrations in the past few months against the global warming and its effects. And the most obvious effect was the recent Australian wildfires. So these concerns were the main reason for the Seattle protests of 1999, during which people protested the international economic order and politicians for systematically rejecting other economic systems and using globalism as an excuse, even though globalism doesn't necessarily mean that neoliberal world order has to prevail. So most protesters were from the political left and from third world countries, and claimed that a more humanitarian and yet global solution was possible. And this protest is significant since it has encouraged other people to speak up and encouraged other movements that defended that a more humanitarian globalism is possible.